More William Part 4. The excitement began at breakfast. William descended slightly late, and, after receiving his parents' reproaches with an air of weary boredom, ate his porridge listlessly. He had come to the conclusion that morning that there was a certain monotonous sameness about life. One got up and had one's breakfast and went to school and had one's dinner and went to school and had one's tea and played and had one's supper and went to bed. Even the fact that today was a half-term holiday did not dispel his depression. One day's holiday. What good was one day? We all have experienced such feelings. Half abstractedly, he began to listen to his elders' conversation. They promised to be here by 9, his mother was saying. I do hope they won't be late. Well, it's not much good they're coming if the other house isn't ready, is it? Said William's grown-up sister Ethel. I don't believe they've even finished painting. I'm so sorry it's William's half-term holiday, sighed Mrs. Brown. He'll be frightfully in the way. William's outlook on life brightened considerably. They coming removing this morning? He inquired cheerfully. Yes. Dio, try not to hinder them, William. Me? He said indignantly. I'm going to help. If William's going to help, remarked his father. Thank heaven I shan't be here. Your assistance, William, always seems to be even more devastating in its results than your opposition. William smiled politely. Sarcasm was always wasted on William. Well, he said, rising from the table, I'd better go and be getting ready to help. 10 minutes later, Mrs. Brown, coming out of the kitchen from her interview with the cook, found to her amazement that the steps of the front door were covered with small ornaments. As she stood staring, William appeared from the drawing room, staggering under the weight of a priceless little statuette that had been the property of Mr. Brown's great-grandfather. William, she gasped. I'm getting all the little things ready for them just to carry straight down. If I put everything on the steps, they don't need come into the house at all. You said you didn't want them tramping in dirty boots. It took a quarter of an hour to replace them. Over the fragments of a blue bowl, Mrs. Brown sighed deeply. I wish you'd broken anything but this, William. Well, he excused himself. You said things do get broken removing. You said so yourself. I didn't break it on purpose. It just got broken removing. At this point, the removers arrived. There were 3 of them. One was very fat and jovial, and one was thin and harassed looking, and a third wore a sheepish smile and walked with a slightly unsteady gait. They made profuse apologies for their lateness. You'd better begin with the dining room, said Mrs. Brown. Will you pack the china first? William, get out of the way. She left them packing, assisted by William. William carried the things to them from the sideboard cupboards. What's your names? He asked, as he stumbled over a glass bowl that he had inadvertently left on the hearth rug. His progress was further delayed while he conscientiously picked up the fragments. Things do get broken removing, he murmured. Mine is Mr. Blake, and his is Mr. Johnson, and his is Mr. Jones. Which is Mr. Jones? The one that walks funny? They shook with great laughter, so much so that a china cream jug slipped from Mr. Blake's fingers and lay in innumerable pieces round his boot. He kicked it carelessly aside. Yes, he said, bending anew to his task. Him what walks funny. Why's he walk funny? Persisted William. Has he hurt his legs? Yes, said Blake with a wink. He hurt them at the Blue Cow coming here. Mr. Jones' sheepish smile broadened into a laugh. Well, you rest, said William sympathetically. You lie down on the sofa and rest. I'll help, so's you needn't do anything. Mr. Jones grew hilarious. Come on, he said. My eye, this young gent's all right, he is. You lie down and rest, he says. Well, here goes. To the huge delight of his companions, he stretched himself at length upon the Chesterfield and closed his eyes. William surveyed him with pleasure. That's right, he said. I'll show you my dog when your legs are better. I've got a fine dog. What sort of a dog? Said Mr. Blake, resting from his labors to ask the question. He's no particular sort of a dog, said William honestly, but he's a jolly fine dog. You should see him do tricks. Well, let's have a look at him. Fetch him art. William, highly delighted, complied, and Jumble showed off his best tricks to an appreciative audience of two. Mr. Jones had already succumbed to the drowsiness that had long been creeping over him and was lying dead to the world on the Chesterfield. Jumble begged for a biscuit. He walked because William's hand firmly imprisoned his front ones. On his hind legs, he leapt over William's arm. He leapt into the very center of an old Venetian glass that was on the floor by the packing case and cut his foot slightly on a piece of it, but fortunately suffered no ill effects. William saw consternation on Mr. Johnson's face and hastened to gather the pieces and fling them lightly into the waste paper basket. It's all right, he said soothingly. She said things get broken removing. When Mrs. Brown entered the room 10 minutes later, Mr. Jones was still asleep, Jumble was still performing, and Mr. Blake and Johnson were standing in negligent attitudes against the wall appraising the eager Jumble with sportsmanlike eyes. He's no breed, Mr. Blake was saying, but he's all right. I'd like to see him after a rat. I bet he'd. Seeing Mrs. Brown, he hastily seized a vase from the mantelpiece and carried it over to the packing case, where he appeared suddenly to be working against time. Mr. Johnson followed his example. Mrs. Brown's eyes fell upon Mr. Jones and she gasped. Whatever, she began. He's not very well, explained Mr. Blake. He'll be all right when he's slept it off. He's always all right when he's slept it off. He's hurt his legs, explained William. He hurt his legs at the Blue Cow. He's just resting. Mrs. Brown swallowed and counted 20 to herself. It was a practice she had acquired in her youth for use in times when words crowded upon her too thick and fast for utterance. At last she spoke with unusual bitterness. Need he rest with his muddy boots on my Chesterfield? At this point Mr. Jones awoke from sleep, hypnotized out of it by her cold eye. He was profuse in his apologies. He believed he had fainted. He had had a bad headache brought on probably by exposure to the early morning sun. He felt much better after his faint. He regretted having fainted on to the ladies' sofa. He partially brushed off the traces of his dirty boots with an equally dirty hand. You've done nothing in this room, said Mrs. Brown. We shall never get finished. William, come away. I'm sure you're hindering them." "Me?" said William in righteous indignation. "Me? I'm helping." After what seemed to Mrs. Brown to be several hours, they began on the heavy furniture. They staggered out with the dining room sideboard, carrying away part of the staircase with it in transit. Mrs. Brown, with a pale face, saw her beloved antique cabinet in pieces against the doorpost, and watched her favorite collapsible card table perform a thorough and permanent collapse. Even the hat stand from the hall was devoid of some pegs when it finally reached the van. "This is simply breaking my heart," moaned Mrs. Brown. "Where's William?" said Ethel gloomily, looking round. "I don't know. He disappeared a few minutes ago. I don't know where he is. I only hope he'll stay there." The removers now proceeded to the drawing room and prepared to take out the piano. They tried it every way. The first way took a piece out of the doorpost, the second made a dent 2 inches deep in the piano, the third knocked over the grandfather clock, which fell with a resounding crash, breaking its glass, and incidentally a tall china plant stand that happened to be in its line of descent. Mrs. Brown sat down and covered her face with her hands. "It's like some dreadful nightmare," she groaned. Mr. Blake, Johnson and Jones paused to wipe the sweat of honest toil from their brows. "I don't know how it's to be got out," said Mr. Blake despairingly. "It got in," persisted Mrs. Brown. "If it got in, it can get out." "We'll have another try," said Mr. Blake with the air of a hero leading a forlorn hope. "Come on, mites." This time was successful, and the piano passed safely into the hall, leaving in its wake only a dislocated door handle and a torn chair cover. It then passed slowly and devastatingly down the hall and drive. The next difficulty was to get it into the van. Mr. Blake, Johnson, and Jones tried alone and failed. For 10 minutes they tried alone and failed. Between each attempt they paused to mop their brows and throw longing glances towards the Blue Cow, whose signboard was visible down the road. The gardener, the cook, the housemaid, and Ethel all gave their assistance, and at last, with a superhuman effort, they raised it to the van. They then all rested weakly against the nearest support and gasped for breath. "Well," said Mr. Jones, looking reproachfully at the mistress of the house, "I've never handled a piano." At this moment a well-known voice was heard in the recesses of the van, behind the piano and sideboard and hat stand. "Hey, let me out. What you've gone blocking up the van for? I cannot get out." There was a horror-stricken silence. Then Ethel said sharply, "What did you go in for?" The mysterious voice came again with a note of irritability. "Well, I was resting. I must have some rest, mustn't I? I've been helping all morning." "Well, couldn't you see we were putting things in?" The unseen presence spoke again. "No, I cannot. I wasn't looking." "You cannot get out, William," said Mrs. Brown desperately. "We cannot move everything again. You must just stop there till it's unpacked. We'll try to push your lunch into you." There was determination in the voice that answered, "I want to get out. I'm going to get out." There came tumultuous sounds, the sound of the ripping of some material, of the smashing of glass, and of William's voice softly ejaculating, "Crumbs! That old-looking glass getting in the way." "You'd better take out the piano again," said Mrs. Brown wanly. It's the only thing to do. With straining and efforts and groans and a certain amount of destruction, the piano was eventually lowered again to the ground. Then the sideboard and hat stand were moved to one side, and finally there emerged from the struggle William and Jumble. Jumble's coat was covered with little pieces of horsehair, as though from the interior of a chair. William's jersey was torn from shoulder to hem. He looked stern and indignant. "A nice thing to do," he began bitterly. "Shutting me up in that old van. How'd you expect me to breathe? Shut in with old bits of furniture. Folks cannot live without air, can they? A nice thing if you'd found me dead." Emotion had deprived his audience of speech for the time being. With a certain amount of dignity, he walked past them into the house, followed by Jumble. It took another quarter of an hour to replace the piano. As they were making the final effort, William came out of the house. "Here, I'll help," he said, and laid a finger on the side. His presence rather hindered their efforts, but they succeeded in spite of it. William, however, was under the impression that his strength alone had wrought the miracle. He put on an outrageous swagger. "I'm jolly strong," he confided to Mr. Blake. "I'm stronger than most folk." Here the removers decided that it was time for their midday meal and retired to consume it in the shady back garden. All except Mr. Jones, who said he would go down the road for a drink of lemonade. William said that there was lemonade in the larder and offered to fetch it, but Mr. Jones said hastily that he wanted a special sort. He had to be very particular what sort of lemonade he drank. Mrs. Brown and Ethel sat down to a scratch meal in the library. William followed his two new friends wistfully into the garden. "William, come to lunch," called Mrs. Brown. "Oh, leave him alone, Mother," pleaded Ethel. "Let us have a little peace." But William did not absent himself for long. "I want a red handkerchief," he demanded loudly from the hall. There was no response. He appeared in the doorway. "I say, I want a red handkerchief. Have you got a red handkerchief, Mother?" "No, dear. Have you, Ethel?" "No." "All right," said William aggrievedly. "You needn't get mad. Need you? I'm only asking for a red handkerchief. I don't want a red handkerchief off you if you haven't got it. Do I?" "William, go away and shut the door." William obeyed. Peace reigned throughout the house and garden for the next half hour. Then Mrs. Brown's conscience began to prick her. "William must have something to eat, dear. Do go and find him." Ethel went out to the back garden. A scene of happy restfulness met her gaze. Mr. Blake reclined against one tree consuming bread and cheese, while a red handkerchief covered his knees. Mr. Johnson reclined against another tree, also consuming bread and cheese, while a red handkerchief covered his knees. William leant against a third tree consuming a little heap of scraps collected from the larder, while on his knees also reposed what was apparently a red handkerchief. Jumble sat in the middle catching with nimble, snapping jaws dainties flung to him from time to time by his circle of admirers. Ethel advanced nearer and inspected William's red handkerchief with dawning horror in her face. Then she gave a scream. "William, that's my silk scarf. It was for a hat. I've only just bought it. Oh, Mother, do something to William." He's taken my new silk scarf. He's the most awful boy. I don't think. Mrs. Brown came out hastily to pacify her. William handed the silk scarf back to its rightful owner. Well, I'm sorry. I thought it was a red handkerchief. It looked like a red handkerchief. Well, how could I know it wasn't a red handkerchief? I've given it her back. It's all right, Jumbles only bit one end of it. And that's only jam what dropped on it. Well, it'll wash, won't it? Well, I've said I'm sorry. I don't get much thanks, William continued bitterly. Me giving up my half-holiday to helping you removing, and I don't get much thanks. Well, William, said Mrs. Brown, you can go to the new house with the first van. He'll be less in the way there, she confided distractedly to the world in general. William was delighted with this proposal. At the new house there was a fresh set of men to unload the van, and there was the thrill of making their acquaintance. Then the front gate was only just painted and bore a notice, wet paint. It was, of course, incumbent upon William to test personally the wetness of the paint. His trousers bore testimony to the testing to their last day, in spite of many attempts at cleaning them. Jumble also tested it, and had in fact to be disconnected with the front gate by means of a pair of scissors. For many weeks, the first thing that visitors to the Brown household saw was a little tuft of Jumble's hair adorning the front gate. William then proceeded to help to the utmost of his power. He stumbled up from the van to the house, staggering under the weight of a medicine cupboard, and leaving a trail of broken bottles and little pools of medicine behind. Jumble sampled many of the latter and became somewhat thoughtful. It was found that the door of a small bedroom at the top of the stairs was locked, and this fact, added to Mr. Jones' failure to return from his lemonade, rather impeded the progress of the unpackers. "Break it open," suggested one. "Better not. Perhaps the key's inside," suggested another brightly. William had one of his brilliant ideas. "Tell you what I'll do," he said eagerly and importantly. "I'll climb up to the roof and get down the chimney and open it from the inside." They greeted the proposal with laughter. They did not know William. It was growing dusk when Mrs. Brown and Ethel and the second van load appeared. "What is that on the gate?" said Ethel, stooping to examine the part of Jumble's coat that brightened up the dullness of the black paint. "It's that dog," she said. Then came a ghost-like cry, apparently from the heavens. "Mother!" Mrs. Brown raised a startled face to the skies. There seemed to be nothing in the skies that could have addressed her. Then she suddenly saw a small face peering down over the coping of the roof. It was a face that was very frightened under a superficial covering of soot. It was William's face. "I cannot get down," it said hoarsely. Mrs. Brown's heart stood still. "Stay where you are, William," she said faintly. "Don't move." The entire staff of removers was summoned. A ladder was borrowed from a neighboring garden and found to be too short. Another was fetched and fastened to it. William, at his dizzy height, was growing irritable. "I cannot stay up here forever," he said severely. At last he was rescued by his friend Mr. Blake and brought down to safety. His account was confused. "I wanted to help. I wanted to open that door for them, so I climbed up by the kitchen roof and the ivy and the drain pipe, and I tried to get down the chimney. I didn't know which one it was, but I tried them all and they were all too little, and I tried to get down by the ivy again, but I couldn't, so I waited till you came and hollered out. I wasn't scared, he said, fixing them with a stern eye. I wasn't scared a bit. I just wanted to get down. And this old black chimney stuff tastes beastly. No, I'm all right, he ended in answer to tender inquiries. I'll go on helping. He was with difficulty persuaded to retire to bed at a slightly earlier hour than usual. Well, he confessed, I'm a bit tired with helping all day. Soon after he had gone, Mr. Brown and Robert arrived. And how have things gone today? Said Mr. Brown cheerfully. Thank heaven William goes to school tomorrow, said Ethel devoutly. Upstairs in his room, William was studying himself in the glass. Torn jersey, paint-stained trousers, blackened face. Well, he said with a deep sigh of satisfaction, I guess I've jolly well helped today. William's family were going to the seaside for February. It was not an ideal month for the seaside, but William's father's doctor had ordered him a complete rest and change. We shall have to take William with us, you know, his wife had said as they discussed plans. Good heavens, groaned Mr. Brown. I thought it was to be a rest cure. Yes, but you know what he is, his wife urged. I daren't leave him with anyone, certainly not with Ethel. We shall have to take them both. Ethel will help with him. Ethel was William's grown-up sister. All right, agreed her husband finally. You can take all responsibility. I formally disown him from now till we get back. I don't care what trouble he lands you in. You know what he is, and you deliberately take him away with me on a rest cure. It cannot be helped, dear, said his wife mildly. William was thrilled by the news. It was several years since he had been at the seaside. Will I be able to go swimming? It won't be too cold. Well, if I wrap up warm, will I be able to go swimming? Can I catch fishes? Are there lots of smugglers smuggling there? Well, I'm only asking, you needn't get mad. One afternoon, Mrs. Brown missed her best silver tray and searched the house high and low for it wildly, while dark suspicions of each servant in turn arose in her usually unsuspicious breast. It was finally discovered in the garden. William had dug a large hole in one of the garden beds. Into the bottom of this he had fitted the tray and had lined the sides with bricks. He had then filled it with water, and taking off his shoes and stockings, stepped up and down his narrow pool. He was distinctly aggrieved by Mrs. Brown's reproaches. Well, I was practicing paddling, ready for going to the seaside. I didn't mean to ruin your tray. You talk as if I meant to ruin your tray. I was only practicing paddling. At last the day of departure arrived. William was instructed to put his things ready on his bed, and his mother would then come and pack for him. He summoned her proudly down the stairs after about 20 minutes. I've got everything ready, Mother. Mrs. Brown ascended to his room. Upon his bed was a large pop gun, a football, a mouse in a cage, a punch ball on a stand, a large box of unusual things, and a deer skin which was his dearest possession and had been presented to him by an uncle from South Africa. Mrs. Brown sat down weakly on a chair. You cannot possibly take any of these things, she said faintly but firmly. Well, you said put my things on the bed for you to pack, and I've put them on the bed. And now you say, I meant clothes. Oh, clothes, scornfully. I never thought of clothes. Well, you cannot take any of these things anyway. William hastily began to defend his collection of treasures. I must have the pop gun 'cause you never know. There may be pirates and smugglers down there, and you can kill a man with a pop gun if you get near enough and know the right place, and I might need it. And I must have the football to play on the sands with and the punch ball to practice boxing on, and I must have the mouse, 'cause to feed him, and I must have this box of things and this skin to show to folks I meet down at the seaside, 'cause they're interesting. But Mrs. Brown was firm, and William reluctantly yielded. In a moment of weakness, finding that his trunk was only 3/4 filled by his things, she slipped in his beloved deerskin, while William himself put the pop gun inside when no one was looking. They had been unable to obtain a furnished house, so had to be content with a boarding house. Mr. Brown was eloquent on the subject. If you're deliberately turning that child loose into a boarding house full, presumably, of quiet, inoffensive people, you deserve all you get. It's nothing to do with me. I'm going to have a rest cure. I've disowned him. He can do as he likes. It cannot be helped, dear, said Mrs. Brown mildly. Mr. Brown had engaged one of the huts on the beach chiefly for William's use, and William proudly furnished its floor with the deerskin. It was killed by my uncle, he announced to the small crowd of children at the door who had watched with interest his painstaking measuring of the floor in order to place his treasure in the exact center. He killed it dead, just like this. William had never heard the story of the death of the buck, and therefore had invented one in which he had gradually come to confuse himself with his uncle in the role of hero. It was walking about and he met it. I hadn't got no gun, and it sprung at me and I caught hold of its neck with one hand and I broke off its horns with the other, and I knocked it over. And it got up and ran at me, him again, and I just tripped it up with my foot and it fell over again, and then I just give it one big hit with my fist right on its head, and it killed it and it died. There was an incredulous gasp. Then there came a clear, high voice from behind the crowd. Little boy, you are not telling the truth. William looked up into a thin, spectacled face. I wasn't telling it to you, he remarked, wholly unconcerned. A little girl with dark curls spoke quite needlessly in William's defense. He's a very brave boy to do all that, she said indignantly. So don't you go saying things to him. Well, said William, flattered but modest, I didn't say I did it, did I? I said my uncle, well, partly my uncle. Mr. Percival Jones looked down at him in righteous wrath. You're a very wicked little boy. I'll tell your father, I'll tell your sister. For Ethel was approaching in the distance and Mr. Percival Jones was in no way unwilling to converse with her. Mr. Percival Jones was a thin, pale, aesthetic would-be poet who lived and thrived on the admiration of the elderly ladies of his boarding house, and had done so for the past 10 years. Once he had published a volume of poems at his own expense. He lived at the same boarding house as the Browns, and had seen Ethel in the distance to meals. He had admired the red lights in her dark hair and the blue of her eyes, and had even gone so far as to wonder whether she possessed the solid and enduring qualities which he would require of one whom in his mind he referred to as his future spouse. He began to walk down the beach with her. I should like to speak to you, about your brother, Miss Brown, he began. If you can spare me the time, of course. I trust one do not, intrude or presume. He is a charming little man, but, I fear, not truthful. May I accompany you a little on your way? I am, much attracted to your, family. I, should like to know. You all better. I am, deeply attached to your, little brother, but grieved to find that he does not, adhere to the truth in his statements. I, Miss Brown's blue eyes were dancing with merriment. Oh, don't you worry about William, she said. He's awful. It's much best just to leave him alone. Isn't the sea gorgeous today? They walked along the sands. Meanwhile, William had invited his small defender into his hut. You can look round, he said graciously. You've seen my skin, what he killed, haven't you? This is my gun. You put a cork in there and it comes out hard when you shoot it. It would kill anyone impressively if you did it near enough to them and at the right place. And I've got a mouse and a punch ball and a box of things and a football, but they wouldn't let me bring them, bitterly. It's a lovely skin, said the little girl. What's your name? William. What's yours? Peggy. Well, let's be on a desert island, shall we? And nothing to eat nor anything, shall we? Come on. She nodded eagerly. How lovely! They wandered out onto the promenade, and among a large crowd of passers, bemoaned the lonely emptiness of the island and scanned the horizon for a sail. In the far distance on the cliffs could be seen the figures of Mr. Percival Jones and William's sister, walking slowly away from the town. At last they turned towards the hut. We must find something to eat, said William firmly. We cannot let ourselves starve to death. Shrimps? Suggested Peggy cheerfully. We haven't got nets, said William. We couldn't save them from the wreck. Shellfish? There aren't any on this island. I know. Seaweed. And we'll cook it. Oh, how lovely! He gathered up a handful of seaweed and they entered the hut, leaving a white handkerchief tied onto the door to attract the attention of any passing ship. The hut was provided with a gas ring, and William, disregarding his family's express injunction, lit this and put on a saucepan filled with water and seaweed. We'll pretend it's a wood fire, he said. We couldn't make a real wood fire out on the prom. They'd stop us. So we'll pretend this is. And we'll pretend we saved a saucepan from the wreck. After a few minutes, he took off the pan and drew out a long green strand. You eat it first, he said politely. The smell of it was not pleasant. Peggy drew back. Oh, no, you first. No, you, said William nobly. You look hungrier than me. She bit off a piece, chewed it, shut her eyes and swallowed. Now you, she said with a shade of vindictiveness in her voice. You're not going to not have any. William took a mouthful and shivered. I think it's gone bad, he said critically. Peggy's rosy face had paled. I'm going home, she said suddenly. You cannot go home on a desert island, said William severely. Well, I'm going to be rescued then, she said. I think I am too, said William. It was lunchtime when William arrived at the boarding house. Mr. Percival Jones had moved his place so as to be nearer Ethel. He was now convinced that she was possessed of every virtue his future spouse could need. He conversed brightly and incessantly during the meal. Mr. Brown grew restless. "The man will drive me mad," he said afterwards. "Chattering away. What's he chattering about anyway? Cannot you stop him chattering? Ethel, you seem to have influence. Chatter, chatter, chatter. Good Lord! And me here for a rest cure." At this point, he was summoned to the telephone and returned distraught. "It's an unknown female," he said. "She says that a boy of the name of William from this boarding house has made her little girl sick by forcing her to eat seaweed. She says it's brutal. Does anyone know I'm here for a rest cure? Where is the boy? Good heavens! Where is the boy?" But William, like Peggy, had retired from the world for a space. He returned later on in the afternoon, looking pale and subdued. He bore the reproaches of his family in stately silence. Mr. Percival Jones was in great evidence in the drawing room. "And soon the spring will be with us once more," he was saying in his high-pitched voice as he leant back in his chair and joined the tips of his fingers together. "The spring, the spring. I have a little effort composed on the coming of spring I will read to you sometime if you will be kind enough to criticize impartially." "Criticize," they chorused. "It will be above criticism." "Oh, do read it to us, Mr. Jones." "I will this evening." His eyes wandered to the door, hoping and longing for his beloved's entrance. But Ethel was with her father at a performance at the Winter Gardens, and he looked and longed in vain. In spite of this, however, the springs of his eloquence did not run dry, and he held forth ceaselessly to his little circle of admirers. The simple pleasures of nature. How few of us, alas, have the gift of appreciating them rightly. This little seaside hamlet with its sea, its promenade, its winter gardens. How beautiful it is. How few appreciate it rightly. Here William entered and Mr. Percival Jones broke off abruptly. He disliked William. "Ah, here comes our little friend. He looks pale. Remorse, my young friend? Beware of untruthfulness. Beware of the beginnings of a life of lies and deception." He laid a hand on William's head and cold shivers ran down William's spine. "Be good, sweet child, and let who will be clever," as the poet says. There was murder in William's heart. At that minute Ethel entered. "No," she snapped. "I sat next a man who smelt of bad tobacco. I hate men who smoke bad tobacco." Mr. Jones assumed an expression of intense piety. "I may boast," he said, "that I have never thus soiled my lips with drink or smoke." There was an approving murmur from the occupants of the drawing room. William had met his father in the passage outside the drawing room. Mr. Brown was wearing a hunted expression. "Can I go into the drawing room?" he said bitterly. "Or is he chattering away in there?" They listened. From the drawing room came the sound of a high-pitched voice. Mr. Brown groaned. "Good Lord," he moaned. and I'm here for a rest cure, and he comes chattering into every room in the house. Is the smoking room safe? Does he smoke? Mr. Percival Jones was feeling slightly troubled in his usually peaceful conscience. He could honestly say that he had never smoked. He could honestly say that he had never drank. But in his bedroom reposed 2 bottles of brandy, purchased at the advice of an aunt in case of emergencies. In his bedroom also was a box of cigars that he had bought for a cousin's birthday gift, but which his conscience had finally forbidden to present. He decided to consign these 2 emblems of vice to the waves that very evening. Meanwhile, William had returned to the hut and was composing a tale of smugglers by the light of a candle. He was much intrigued by his subject. He wrote fast in an illegible hand in great sloping lines, his brows frowning, his tongue protruding from his mouth as it always did in moments of mental strain. His sympathies wavered between the smugglers and the representatives of law and order. His spelling was the despair of his teachers. "Ho!" says Dick Savage, he wrote. "Roll the bottles of beer up the beach. Fill your pockets with the tobacco from the boat. Quick, now. We are observed." He looked round in the darkness. In less time than what it takes to write this, he was surrounded by policemen and stood, proud and defiant, in the light of their electric torches. "Surrender!" cried one, holding a gun at his brain and a drawn sword at his heart. "Surrender or die." "Never," said Dick Savage, throwing back his head, proud and defiant. "Never. Do to me what you will, you dirty dogs. I will never surrender. Sooner will I die." One cruel brute hit him a blow on the lips and he sprang back, snarling with rage. In less time than what it takes to write this, he had sprung at his torturer's throat and his teeth met in one mighty bite. His torturer dropped dead and lifeless at his feet. "Ho!" cried Dick Savage, throwing back his head, proud and defiant again. "So dies any of you what insults my proud manhood. I will meet my teeth in your throats." For a minute they stood trembling. Then one, bolder than the rest, leapt forward and tied Dick Savage's hands with rope behind his back. Another took from his pockets bottles of beer and tobacco in large quantities. "Ho!" they shouted. "Ho!" Dick Savage the smuggler caught at last. Dick Savage gave one proud and defiant laugh, and, bringing his tied hands over his head, he bit the rope with one mighty bite. "Ho! Ho!" he cried, throwing back his proud head. "Ho! Ho! You dirty dogs!" Then, drinking a large bottle of poison he had concealed in his shirt, he fell dead and lifeless at their feet. There was a timid knock at the door and William, scowling impatiently, rose to open it. "What d'you want?" he said curtly. A little voice answered from the dusk. "It's me, Peggy. I've come to see how you are, William. They don't know I've come. I was awful sick after that seaweed this morning, William." William looked at her with a superior frown. "Go away," he said. "I'm busy." "What you doing?" she said, poking her little curly head into the doorway. "I'm writing a tale." She clasped her hands. "Oh, how lovely. Oh, William, do read it to me. I'd love it." He opened the door and she took her seat on his deer skin on the floor, and William sat by the candle, clearing his throat for a minute before he began. During the reading, she never took her eyes off him. At the end, she drew a deep breath. "Oh, William, it's beautiful. William, are there smugglers now?" "Oh, yes, millions," he said carelessly. "Here? Of course there are." She went to the door and looked out at the dusk. "I'd love to see one. What do they smuggle, William?" He came and joined her at the door, walking with a slight swagger as became a man of literary fame. "Oh, beer and cigars and things. Millions of them." A furtive figure was passing the door, casting suspicious glances to left and right. He held his coat tightly round him, clasping something inside it. "I expect that's one," said William casually. They watched the figure out of sight. Suddenly William's eyes shone. "Let's stalk him and catch him," he said excitedly. "Come on, let's take some weapons." He seized his pop gun from a corner. "You take," he looked round the room, "you take the wastepaper basket to put over his head and pin down his arms and something to tie him up. I know, the skin he shot in Africa. You can tie his paws in front of him. Come on, let's catch him smuggling." He stepped out boldly into the dusk with his pop gun, followed by the blindly obedient Peggy carrying the wastepaper basket in one hand and the skin in the other. Mr. Percival Jones was making quite a little ceremony of consigning his brandy and cigars to the waves. He had composed a little effort upon it which began, "O deep ocean, receive these objects vile, which never more mine eyes shall soil." He went down to the edge of the sea and, taking a bottle in each hand, held them out at arm's length, while he began in his high-pitched voice, "O deep ocean, receive these." He stopped. A small boy stood beside him, holding out at him the point of what in the semi-darkness Mr. Jones took to be a loaded rifle. William mistook his action in holding out the bottles. "It's no good trying to drink it up," he said severely. "We've caught you smuggling." Mr. Percival Jones laughed nervously. "My little man," he said, "that's a very dangerous thing for you to have. Suppose you hand it over to me. Now, like a good little chap." William recognized his voice. "Fancy you being a smuggler all the time," he said with righteous indignation in his voice. "Take away that nasty gun, little boy," pleaded his captive plaintively. "You don't understand it. It might go off." William was not a boy to indulge in half measures. He meant to carry the matter off with a high hand. "I'll shoot you dead," he said dramatically, "if you don't do just what I tell you." Mr. Percival Jones wiped the perspiration from his brow. "Where did you get that rifle, little boy?" he asked in a voice he strove to make playful. Is it loaded?" "It's unwise, little boy. Most unwise. Give it to me to take care of. It might go off, you know." William moved the muzzle of his weapon, and Mr. Percival Jones shuddered from head to foot. William was a brave boy, but he had experienced a moment of cold terror when first he had approached his captive. The first note of the trembling, high-pitched voice had, however, reassured him. He instantly knew himself to be the better man. His captive's obvious terror of his pop gun almost persuaded him that he held in his hand some formidable death-dealing instrument. As a matter of fact, Mr. Percival Jones was temperamentally an abject coward. "You walk up to the seats," commanded William. "I've took you prisoner for smuggling and just walk up to the seats." Mr. Percival Jones obeyed immediately. "Don't, press anything, little boy," he pleaded as he went. "It, might go off by accident. You might do, untold damage." Peggy, armed with the wastepaper basket and the skin, followed open-mouthed. At the seat, William paused. "Peggy, you put the basket over his head and pin his arms down, case he struggles, and tie the skin what I shot round him, case he struggles." Peggy stood upon the seat and obeyed. Their victim made no protest. He seemed to himself to be in some horrible dream. The only thing of which he was conscious was the dimly seen weapon that William held out at him in the darkness. He was hardly aware of the wastepaper basket thrust over his head. He watched William anxiously through the basket work. "Be careful," he murmured. "Be careful, boy." He hardly felt the skin which was fastened tightly round his unresisting form by Peggy, the tail tied to one front paw. Unconsciously, he still clasped a bottle of brandy in each arm. Then came the irate summons of Peggy's nurse through the dusk. "Oh, William," she said, panting with excitement. "I don't want to leave you. Oh, William, he might kill you. You go on." "I'm all right," he said with conscious valor. "He cannot do nothing, 'cause I've got a gun and I can shoot him dead." Mr. Percival Jones shuddered again. "And he's all tied up and I've took him prisoner and I'm going to take him home." "Oh, William, you are brave," she whispered in the darkness as she flitted away to her nurse. William blushed with pride and embarrassment. Mr. Percival Jones was convinced that he had to deal with a youthful lunatic, armed with a dangerous weapon, and was anxious only to humor him till the time of danger was over and he could be placed under proper restraint. Unconscious of his peculiar appearance, he walked before his captor, casting calming glances behind him. "It's all right, little boy," he said soothingly. "Quite all right. I'm, your friend. Don't, get annoyed, little boy. Don't, get annoyed. Won't you put your gun down, little man? Won't you let me carry it for you?" William walked behind, still pointing his pop gun. "I've took you prisoner for smuggling," he repeated doggedly. "I'm taking you home. You're my prisoner. I've took you." They met no one on the road, though Mr. Percival Jones threw longing glances around, ready to appeal to any passer-by for rescue. He was afraid to raise his voice in case it should rouse his youthful captor to murder. He saw with joy the gate of his boarding house and hastened up the walk and up the stairs. The drawing-room door was open. There was help and assistance. There was protection against this strange persecution. He entered, followed closely by William. It was about the time he had promised to read his little effort on the coming of spring to his circle of admirers. A group of elderly ladies sat round the fire awaiting him. Ethel was writing. They turned as he entered and a gasp of horror and incredulous dismay went up. It was that gasp that called him to a realization of the fact that he was wearing a wastepaper basket over his head and shoulders, and that an old fur rug was tied round his arms. "Mr. Jones!" they gasped. He gave a wrench to his shoulders and the rug fell to the floor, revealing a bottle of brandy clasped in either arm. "Mr. Jones!" they repeated. "I caught him smuggling," said William proudly. "I caught him smuggling beer by the sea, and he was drinking those 2 bottles he'd smuggled, and he had thousands and thousands of cigars all over him. And I caught him, and he's a smuggler, and I brought him up here with my gun. He's a smuggler, and I took him prisoner." Mr. Jones, red and angry, his hair awry, glared through the wickerwork of his basket. He moistened his lips. "This is an outrage," he said. Horrified elderly eyes stared at the incriminating bottles. "He was drinking them by the sea," said William. "Mr. Jones!" they chorused again. He flung off his wastepaper basket and turned upon the proprietress of the establishment who stood by the door. "I will not brook such treatment," he stammered in fury. "I leave your roof tonight. I am outraged, humiliated. I disdain to explain. I leave your roof tonight." "Mr. Jones!" they said once more. Mr. Jones, still clasping his bottles, withdrew, pausing to glare at William on his way. "You wicked boy! You wicked little untruthful boy!" he said. William looked after him. "He's my prisoner and they've let him go," he said aggrievedly. 10 minutes later, he wandered into the smoking room. Mr. Brown sat miserably in a chair by a dying fire beneath a poor light. "Is he still chattering there?" he said. "Is this still the only corner where I can be sure of keeping my sanity? Is he reading his beastly poetry upstairs? Is he—" "He's going," said William moodily. "He's going before dinner. They've sent for his cab. He's mad 'cause I said he was a smuggler. He was a smuggler 'cause I saw him doing it and I took him prisoner and he got mad and he's going. And they're mad at me 'cause I took him prisoner. You'd think they'd be glad at me catching smugglers, but they're not." Bitterly. "And mother says she'll tell you and you'll be mad too," and Mr. Brown raised his hand. "1 minute, my son," he said. "Your story is confused. Do I understand that Mr. Jones is going and that you are the cause of his departure?" "Yes, 'cause he got mad, 'cause I said he was a smuggler and he was a smuggler and they're mad at me now," and Mr. Brown laid a hand on his son's shoulder. "There are moments, William," he said, "when I feel almost affectionate towards you.